process, which, when well performed, is essentially melodramatic. One bound, you're into the first step. Turn your body lightly, round to the right, and you're on the second step. Bend gracefully beneath the reins, working round to the left at the same time, and you are in the cab. There's no difficulty in finding a seat. The apron knocks you in comfortably into it at once, and off you go.
We have, as Linda said, many of the authors that have preceded us have recorded our history, and I would encourage any of you who wish to write about what we're doing today to do that, because the way we've learned much about what's happened in history is not only from Charles Dickens, but from the other authors like Fairman Rogers and Underhill and Weir, who have all helped us to understand what pleasure driving and Turnout is. This vehicle was truly a gentleman's vehicle years ago, and interestingly enough, Hansom Cabs came to the United States in 1870. It had been almost the previous century that they had been used in Paris and in London, and they were very late arrivals on the scene here in the United States. And interestingly enough, from what I can read, it appears that the commercial Hansom Cab only became popular after the very wonderful turnouts that were done by private owners. And this is a private cab. It is a private cab, and I'm going to let Patrick Schroven, who is the restorer or the expert in this case, to talk about the differences between a private and public cab. And also, if you have some questions on the restoration from Patrick, Patrick is noted the world over for his workmanship. These are all hand-painted vehicles, and he not only does them for the royal houses in Europe, but he also has done it for Lady Wearsdale, as I have been dubbed here in the United States. Here's Patrick Schroeder.
The public cab was used as a taxi around big cities by the end of last century. More precisely in London, there were thousands and thousands of them, and most of them were destructed after the First World War. They were so popular that at a certain time they were called the gondola of London. The ones that we find in museums are mostly of the public cab type. They are quite angular outlines. They have simple square moldings, square windows. They have often one or two windows at the back through which the passenger could look backwards. It was always a lid on the roof that a cab driver could open to speak to his passengers. Next to the lid was a handle that the cab driver would use to open the two little doors at the front. There was also a leather strap that he used to get the windows open before opening the doors. That makes that, in fact, the passengers were enclosed in the vehicle and they couldn't get out except for when the cab driver opened the doors. So they had to pay the fare before getting out. The lamps were generally of what I call the omnibus or large phaeton style, quite simple and not so ornate as these ones. The upholstery was comfortable, often in leather, deep buttoned, but not very fancy. And there was no crest in the vehicle. Now this one is clearly a private Hansom Cab. It is very ornate, it has a lot of molding and scrolls on the body. Some private Hansom Cabs have also the handle that the driver would use to open the doors. This one has no lid and no handle. It's clearly that this one has always been used as a private cab. The lamps are very fancy. The maker of the cab is Nickel, a famous builder of Hansom Cabs in New York and Chicago. Although the lamps bear the name of Brewster, we didn't want to take that name off because they are so valuable. Sometimes a private cab would also have a crest or the owner's initials on the panel. There have been questions asked about the size of the wheels, and indeed, when I found the vehicle in derelict state in the barn, I had my questions about the size of the wheels too. But we soon found out that given the height of the shafts above the ground, if the wheels would be much higher, it would be impossible to find a horse to fit the vehicle. Also, we found the old paint and the old striping on the wheels matching the cab, and the fellows were original. So I am almost sure the spokes have never been cut back and the wheels were built that size. The vehicle bears the serial number 1711 found on the back panel inside. And finally, I would like to finish on a humoristic note. The gondola of London was also known as a vehicle where the superior sits in the interior and cannot see the posterior of his inferior on the exterior.
Another demonstrate the counterbalance of the driver and the jack stand, which we'll do. But my next thing is to do this. That oftentimes meant walk on. 2 whistles, turn right, turn left, go home. I want you to understand that it's very difficult to talk to David when he's above. So if you were the private owner of this cab, you would have some means with you to signal David as to what to do. And you were in total control, unlike the commercial cab where you had to pay David before he would use the lever to let you out. So in this cab, you can get outside. I want to have David talk to you now a little bit about how he's retired. He's up in the air so high, I hope you can all see his outfit. Oh, you stop. We have 2 cars. Take him back forward just a little. About. I think good enough. Okay, when the cab driver would stop the horse for a long period of time, he would relieve the pressure off the horse's back of the heavy shafts. Whoops, that was too far forward. If we were on a solid street, it would demonstrate better. But I think you can all see the jack stand and the leather strap that it's attached to. David has control of that. And so when he would get ready to dismount, he'd put the weight on the jack stand so it would be off the horse's back. So now he can dismount the carriage, and I'm going to let him talk to you now about his outfit and what a handsome cabsman would have known. Do you want me to tell him about the whiskers, though? Sure. We read in one of our articles that in the late 1800s, the owners of private conveyances such as this, such as would be myself if I lived back then, so I can fantasize, they all got together and they thought it was rather uncouth for the cabsman or the coachman to have whiskers and mustaches. So when David and I read this, it was about 2 days later, and David appeared at the stable with no mustache. And if you know David Saunders, his mustache has been part of his character for a number of years. But I think in honor of the demonstration today and of his owners, or his what do you call me, sponsor, or what? What am I to you? David has shaved his mustache for this occasion. Yeah, I'm going to let David tell you about his outfit.
But the story on the whiskers was that I was probably one of the youngest coachmen in the Royal Mews working for the Queen. And as most young men, they try to act and look older. So what I did was I grew a moustache, and it's sort of been with me for a long time. But soon after I grew it, Sir John Miller, who was the Crown Equerry at the time, came over to me and said, you know something, Saunders, it's very, very, very wrong for anyone to drive the Queen or any members of the royal household with whiskers. And I said, well, I'm very sorry, Sir John, and I'll shave them off. And the next day I happened to mention it to Prince Philip, who mentioned it to the Queen, and the Queen said, oh no, that's fine. Having said that, I want you to realise how important it is. It was all right for me to keep my whiskers for the Queen. And the second, the more important fact is, he's a little bit better than the Queen. I'm wearing a typical undressed livery, a black frock coat with the buttons that are covered up because it has to be very understated. It's an undressed livery. Black livery boots, black pants, gloves, stock tie and stiff collar, black top hat with a cockade. There's several ideas about the cockade. Generally, the cockade denoted the rank of the person that you were working for, and the number of points on the cockade denoted whether you were a belted earl, a baron, a viscount, or whatever. This is just a cockade that we had, and we've elevated Gloria to its status. There's several things about the whip. As you can see, it was very this is actually a black fiberglass whip. I couldn't get a nice black whalebone whip because they're quite rare, but this actually does the job quite well. You would never use a holly whip. You'd have a black whip because this is a whip that matches the outfit, and it's got a fairly long lash because I've got to actually hit the horse because the horse is such a long way away. The other thing with the harness, you probably noticed the reins are very long as well, and it's really a strange feeling to drive this. It's a shame people can't sit there next to me because it's a very strange feeling. You're sitting up very high, as high if not higher than a coach, but you're actually way, way behind the horse. One other thing, when Antonio made the coat for me, I asked him to put in, which is very common for cab drivers, there's a little money pocket just here, and all contributions will be gratefully received. For the distressed coachman fund. No, but it was true because you always have to, the coachman well, in fact the coachman would always carry some sort of money in case the owner needed to buy something or to tip someone or to tip something or to whatever. So that's really quite an interesting point.
David, what about your hat? Decoration on the hat.
The cockade, yeah, did you just arrive?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah, we talked about the cockade, and we mentioned about the different number of points. Some people think it's more appropriate and some people don't. But I think it's actually a good idea to wear a cockade because then people can realise that you're not the owner, you're a servant. I know that has a bad connotation over here, being a servant, but actually I worked for 16 years for the Queen in service to the Queen and was very proud and privileged to have done it. It was a wonderful job because you actually do something, and in the end we're all servants to someone, whether it's to the IRS or to the president or something like that.
Florida, David teaches four-in-hand lessons with our horses that you've seen me go out with today or in the previous 3 days, or pair lessons or tandem lessons, and I would bet if you twist his arm, he might give you lessons on how to drive a Hansom Cab. I know that's not going to be a big draw, I would guess, but you're always welcome to come to our farm and hopefully learn a new driving skill. I wanted to give you just a bit of background on the derivation of the word cab. Now, if Mary Farrell's here or Tom Ryder, would they come forward because they can explain this probably much better than I can. Is Tom Ryder here or Mary Farrell?
Well, the word cab is an abbreviation of the word cabriolet, and that was the word that was used in France for some little two-wheeled vehicles that were brought from Florence into France in the 17th century. And because the roads were very rough at that time, these two-wheel vehicles, when driven at the top, used to bounce and about a little, you see. So the word cabriolet is related to the Latin word for a goat. In other words, this carriage bounded like a goat, so they called it a cabriolet. And the word had the definition changed over the years, but it eventually, the word cabriolet in England was used to refer to a fine two-wheeler with a very bold, nice horse, a private carriage for a gentleman and a little servant, a little smaller than David, who was referred to as a tiger, stood on the back. But later, a cabriolet form of four-wheeler, which was used in France, was brought over to England and became a public vehicle. And of course, as people do, they like to abbreviate it, so the cab came to mean a public vehicle. And it could be a four-wheeler or a two-wheeler. And in this sense, a hansom cab, really, the word cab refers to its use as a public vehicle. Thank you.
Amazing innovation in cabs came in England in about 1820. In the previous cabriolets that were used in France and in England, the driver actually sat with the passenger, and there was one or a small person in the back to attend to the needs. But the important innovation in 1820 was that driver of the vehicle moved to the roof seat position. And so this allowed the cab driver to take on two fares instead of one, which was very important economically. It's interesting to note that Hansom's first vehicle that he patented in 1834 did not look at all like this vehicle. It was a imitation of what was known as a minibus earlier on, and there are many people that suppose that Hansom actually didn't design the first one, since he was an architect, but he actually stole the design from this minibus arrangement. This is where the driver sat on the front of the vehicle, and there were two doors on either side of the driver's feet. It was later on that a gentleman by the name of Chapman designed a vehicle similar to what you see here today, and this was 2 years later, where the driver moved from the front of the box to the rear seat position as we're seeing here today. So we're looking more at what should probably be called a Chapman cab. But in fact, Hansom's name stuck with it because he bought Chapman's patent right. And what happened in the early days is they tried to stress the safety, because this vehicle had a rather rakish reputation and was often viewed to be unsafe. But if you had Hansom patent safety on the side of your cab, you were assured that the company that had owned the Hansom cab had warranted its safety. And by sheer fact that this patent safety Hansom patent safety writing was on the side of the cabs is how this name has stuck over the generations. So it is believed by some that Hansom actually had nothing to do with the design, but it was because they warranted the safety of the vehicle that the name has stayed with it, which is a very interesting phenomenon to me. In our litigious society also, you might be interested to know that there were a number of cab producers in London, or cab manufacturers, that tried to reproduce the Hansom cab, and it was patented. So the company that owned the Hansom cab patent started suing all of these small companies, and in fact they couldn't even collect enough money from these small companies to pay for their legal fees, because those small companies were so unsuccessful they had no assets to bring in. So in fact they stopped their lawsuits because there were no other production companies at the time that actually legitimately could compete with the Hansom Cab company, which is an interesting thing about lawsuits. I want to, I think at this point, to entertain any questions you might have, and Patrick is still up here, David's here. I want to thank Linda Beaulieu. I want to mention that she has helped us throughout our driving career with Turnout, and she is now, as of a week ago, a retired school teacher. So we need to give her some thanks and applause, and hopefully will continue. Is I understand, there were limited number of companies in the United States that manufactured Hansom cabs. Nichols was one. There was also the one Hinks and Johnson was another manufacturer. In fact, they had rather large orders from the Philadelphia Railroad Company. They would order 30 cabs at a time to transport passengers from the railroad station to various destinations in Philadelphia. And then also, many of you may know that Brewster also manufactured Hansom cabs. But I think the interesting thing for we Americans to know is that it was the private Hansom cab that really spawned the interest in commercial cab work here in the United States.
The little wheels on the front, these are peculiar, I think, to Nichols. They weren't normally like that. You normally had just a stand to drop the cab forward. The problem, obviously, the horse now has got all the weight on his back. When I sit on the back, there's actually no weight on the horse's back, so it's actually very well balanced. One of the interesting things we found out in the research was that there was 3 golden rules for a private cabbie or a professional coach, and that was to be smart, to be courteous, and to be quiet.
Wheels were to rest the carriage on once it was taken away from the horse, okay? It was for storage purposes. Because if what we're going to do at the end of this demonstration, if you want to stay around long enough, we're going to unhitch the horse and let you lift the shaft weight. And if you've ever gone through museums and lifted the shaft weight on a Hansom cab, you've probably thought, oh, how strange, because with our single horses, balance is so important, and we have very lightweight vehicles, and when we drive in 2-wheeled vehicles, we want the shafts to float. Well, in fact, when the cabsman is on the back of the vehicle, the shafts do float. But the down weight on the shafts is absolutely incredible, so you needed a strong stand to support the weight of the cab. And many people probably would not have been able to pick up the shafts had they rested on the ground. And you could see the body or the front part of the body would hit the ground first. So you needed some sort of stand mechanism for it to go on. And Nichols suggested the rollers or the little wheels are, if they do strike the pavement, they keep rolling. It's just like your roller stops on the sides of your cut-under vehicles. You have some roller stops so that they'll keep moving. And in fact, when we were trying this out the other day, they did hit the ground down here, and you could hear them scuff the ground. Remember, these were city vehicles, and they were used on city streets. So they were driven on very level surfaces, so more likely than not, they did not strike the ground.
There's several major differences. It's really just a single set, but it has some peculiarities. The saddle, because the horse is carrying so much weight, or the pad, is really very substantial. As you can see, it's a full-bodied pad. It's very substantial. It has a tree in it. There's a lot of debate. We looked at hundreds of pictures, photographs, black and white, and prints and stuff like that. And the way the trace is connected to the cab is through, I don't know whether you call it the same thing here, we call it a pigtail. It's a very English method of connecting the traces. The commercial cabs always had like a chain end trace, but that was very inappropriate for a private cab because you wanted it to be as quiet and as discreet as possible. And we've actually had this harness made with both types of traces. There's the short trace with the short tug, and we've actually got the longer trace, so there's no short tug buckle to interrupt the shafts here, and that is actually moved back here, so you have an adjustment at the back. And so it was actually driven both ways with a long continuous trace with just holes here, and then you had a short piece that was actually on the pigtail, and you could buckle it at the back. So it was actually used both ways. The bridle is, again, very substantial because the horse had to be in it all day. The breeching was fully lined. The crest, which would be suitable only for a private cab, we've got double buckles on this, which makes it much more dressy, and the K collar, which again makes it much more dressy, and the patent leather collar. If it was a commercial harness, it would be very informal. It'd be clean, safe and tidy, but it would actually be very much more informal harness. This horse, as you can see, was a slight cock up on my front actually, because this horse really is about a hand too small. As you can see, the cab is actually sitting down a little bit. It's quite interesting. This cab really needs a horse of about 16.2. This horse is about 15.3, and that was really my fault. I thought this horse would fit, but we had to manage with what we've got because these horses were doing something else. But you can see actually this horse is really a little bit light for this cab.
Just to the horse to the cab now, is there a certain the leg movement?
No, this is Mr. Ryder will probably correct me on this, but there's also a cab-fronted. You can have a cab-fronted Brougham, and people talk about cab-fronted vehicles, which is very typically this shape, where the horse is really close to the vehicle. Now, someone asked me earlier on about why would they have such a small vehicle. If, for instance, the master of the house or the mistress of the house was commuting every day to the station, rather than take a four-wheel Brougham out, which could jackknife easily and I'd need a lot of room to turn around in, with this two-wheeler I could actually drive up onto the platform and turn around completely, drop them exactly at the train and turn around and go back off again. Now obviously the further you move the horse away, the longer you are and the more room you're taking up. The other thing you have to remember is this was used in narrow streets, congested streets, so you needed to be as compact as possible. This was actually like a compact car.
We think this cab weighs about 900 pounds, is that correct? A little bit more, okay. So they were heavy vehicles for one horse to pull, but they were pulled on city streets.
Bigger, and the shafts were up another 3 or 4 inches, they'd be another 3 or 4 inches off the ground. But I think this cab was used on very flat, level surfaces. You wouldn't really want to use it over rough ground. It's interesting you said Hackney. In London, the black cabs are still called Hackney cabs, and the Hackney was the original workhorse. The other derivation of the term may be that we often in Britain refer to as going out for a ride as going out for a hack, and we call it a jacket, a hacking jacket. So I'm not quite sure where that term came from, but a Hackney would be a superb horse for this vehicle. But basically in a private household, they would use a horse that was obviously very quiet, but also fairly flashy, but it had to be really responsive, as I showed you before, because you may get into problems where you have to back, go sideways. And what you really need to do is when people are sitting in there, I don't think Gloria would mind, but if one or two of you want to actually sit up on the driver's seat, you'll realise that you really have to have a really honest Christian horse to be driving, because otherwise you'll get into real trouble, because there's absolutely nothing you can do if he starts playing up. I mean, you're so far away you can't do anything. Yeah, you all thought you were here for horses. We're going to have a revival meeting.
Who would like to try climbing up on the cab seat? I think Shadow will tolerate that. Is there someone? Yes, John? We train them this way at our place. We train them so they can do just about anything. And by the way, this is one of our most versatile horses because Shadow goes at the wheel as well as the lead. And this is his second time in the cab. John, would you like to get up in the cab seat? Come on up here, John Greenall. Everybody knows John Greenall.
If you've never done it, you may never get the chance again. It's a very interesting position and unique driving. Pick up the end of your reins though, John. What do you do about this? Will you put this
It's on your finger, on your big finger.
Very nice.
Comfy?
Here.
Oh, I know what to hit. I know what.
Would you hire this man?
David, I tell you, if we have any problems, I know who's the next guy in the cab seat.
Shoulders back, time for a shoulder. Show them off. That's better.
That's right, wonderful. Would anybody else like to try it? Carol Wright, and Carol is from Virginia. Okay, Carol. We know Carol because we see her at all of these conferences. Okay.
Notice I help the ladies.
I know. How does it feel to be up there, Carol? You aren't getting a nosebleed or anything, are you?
Oh, no, I'm doomed.
One more person, would one more person like to try it? And then we'll do some, oh, our gal, this is Sandra And Sandra runs one of the nicest pleasure driving shows we have in New York State from Casanova, New York, and she's done it for a number of years. Go home, do you remember how many whistles went home?